I've said it before and I'll say it again. Kendrick Lamar is arguably the most important and accomplished rapper of the 21st century. In the past 15 years, he's done so much on record, but perhaps nothing more impressive than his 2015 album To Pimp a Butterfly. March 15th, 2025 is the 10th anniversary of this incredible record, so I thought it would be a great time to take a deep dive on it. Let's analyze one of the most influential hip-hop records of all time and see where it stands at 10 years old. It's kind of hard for me to really accurately dissect one of the most musically dense and ideologically thoughtful albums that I've ever heard, but I'm gonna take my best stab at it. Before we get into To Pimp a Butterfly, let's remind ourselves of how Kendrick got to where he was in about 2014. Of course, today we see him as the ultra high-profile Super Bowl halftime show performer, the architect behind the perfectly simple and straightforward GNX, and the man who absolutely burned the living daylights out of Drake in 2024. But a decade ago, he was in his mid to late 20s, he was 2 albums deep, and he was basking in the success of those first 2 records. His debut, Section 80, was released in 2011 following a handful of mixtapes in the previous years, culminating in 2010's Overly Dedicated. As Kendrick, Ab-Soul, Schoolboy Q, and J-Rock emerged in the early 2010s as the collective Black Hippie, signed to Top Dog Entertainment, the playing field was pretty level, and those other 3 names at one point were regarded to have as much potential as Kendrick Lamar. Section 80 was very well received and built up some serious hype around Kendrick, which set him up nicely for his second album, 2012's Good Kid, Mad City. We all know the significance of how important Good Kid, Mad City was as a breakout album to Kendrick. It was meticulously crafted and curated with some very high-profile guest appearances. As a result, it became a massive critical and commercial success that drove Kendrick Lamar's career into the stratosphere. Just 26 years old when he dropped Good Kid, Mad City, the album vaulted him to new levels of success after about a decade of grinding out of his native Compton, California. This densely layered, carefully built album set a new bar for Kendrick and other artists that at the time it seemed it was impossible that anybody was going to top that standard that he had set on Good Kid, Mad City. It was a generational album, and by the mid-2010s, many people, including myself, were wondering where would he go from here. He took a trip to South Africa about a year after Good Kid, Mad City was released, adding him to a relatively short list of enlightened rappers who decided to visit Africa after achieving some success. When I think of this, the first thing that comes to my mind is Wu-Tang Clan's Ghostface Killah and RZA visiting Africa in the late 90s following the success of Iron Man and Wu-Tang Forever. Ghostface was extremely inspired by his trip, and it led his second album, Supreme Clientele, to be extremely unique and subsequently successful. Supreme Clientele actually just celebrated its 25th anniversary in February, and I did a video on this one too. I'll link it up in the corner. Apparently there was a similar impact for Kendrick as he was deeply inspired by his trip. He decided to put together an album that was of course a hip-hop album at heart, but he wanted to make sure he strongly and accurately represented different forms of African American music, such as jazz, funk, and soul. To facilitate this, he brought in a large number of musicians and contributors to help with putting his next album together. The number of talented artists that came together and made his next album what it is extremely robust, and it's something I'll touch on in detail in a little bit. So after letting Good Kid, Mad City breathe for the better part of 2 years, Kendrick Lamar announced his next album in the middle of 2014, and subsequently followed up in September of that year with the album's first single, I. Immediately touted for its upbeat demeanor and calls for self-love to be practiced among downtrodden African American youth, I was an attention-grabbing statement that let the world know that Kendrick Lamar was evolving in new directions. Musically, it samples the Isley Brothers' That Lady, and immediately demonstrated that Kendrick Lamar, with the help of producer Raki, was ready to really push new sonic boundaries. The iconic music video for I dropped at the end of 2014 and further built upon the already existing hype. The next single, The Blacker the Berry, was released in February 2015, about a month before the album dropped. During a time where the slayings of African Americans by police had been documented more than ever before, the song seemed rather appropriate and almost as a rallying cry, and it was a fierce, racially charged look into the precarious life of a black man in America. These racial themes would be very present throughout the entire upcoming record, though they are perhaps at their most furious on The Blacker the Berry. Now, before I move forward any further, I want to make it clear that I know that I am an outsider to this type of music. I am obviously white, and due to my skin color and subsequent automatic privilege, I have not had to deal with anything that Kendrick Lamar is speaking about on The Blacker the Berry. The themes from the album's second lead single are explored in greater depth throughout To Pimp a Butterfly, and I just want to make it clear that I am fully aware that I am analyzing this from an outsider's perspective, so maybe I'm not going to get everything right. That doesn't compromise the fact that I think this album is some of the most powerful, influential music that I've ever heard from any music genre ever, and I feel like it's one of the most important albums that society has heard in quite some time. I feel like given the injustices at the time, which 10 years later better haven't really improved too much at all, this music is perpetually relevant and beyond important. To Pimp a Butterfly is a work of art for many, many different reasons, but the lyrical themes are a major part of this and must be acknowledged by any casual hip-hop fan who is tuning into this album for maybe the first or second time. This album is extremely deep, meaningful, and its subject matter is not to be taken lightly, especially by outsiders like myself. It's one of those situations where if you're like me, you need to just kind of shut up and listen until you get it. So, after The Blacker the Berry let the world know that the album wasn't going to be quite as lighthearted and upbeat as the song I had suggested, the hype only continued to build. Kendrick Lamar's third album, To Pimp a Butterfly, was officially released on March 15th, 2015, and immediately it turned the hip-hop and music world squarely on its head. I'm gonna do my best with this. There is surely something I'm gonna miss here at some point, as this album is just so deep, so layered, so mind-bending. It's a 16-track, 78-minute album that deals with politics, racism, personal transcendence, societal exploitation, and does it all while utilizing and celebrating elements of African-American music styles like jazz, funk, soul, and even old-school West Coast hip-hop. There are even elements of free-form poetry in this thing. Kendrick spins and delivers the concept all on his own, but he is carried by a number of strategic guest appearances, production credits, and live instrumentation. Take the opener, Wesley's Theory, where Flying Lotus gets a co-production credit as Parliament Funkadelic legend George Clinton is brought in for a vocal guest appearance. And modern-day West Coast legend Thundercat provides both bass and vocals. The track is a funky, upbeat start to the album that immediately sees Kendrick Lamar call out the exploitation of African-American art forms by white society. He introduces the evil character Uncle Sam, who is obviously representative of the US government, who is pretty much the symbol for this unjust society. This theme is continued into the next track, the interlude For Free, which features a wild free jazz instrumental as Kendrick delivers his lines in the form of slam poetry. Musically, this is probably the most chaotic and mind-bending moment of the entire album, very early on no less. Saxophonist Terrace Martin lays down some wild melodies on this thing. The listener is given a quick reprise on yet another funky, bouncy cut on King Kunta, which is a triumphant track where we see Kendrick paying homage to Kunta Kinte, the main character in Alex Haley's revolutionary novel Roots, the Saga of an American Family. The track has strong elements of traditional funk and is probably one of the most upbeat and enjoyable moments on the entire album, where Kendrick doesn't hesitate to flex his confidence, along the way warning the hip-hop industry that he almost killed a couple rappers before they did it to themselves. Now, it's at the end of King Kunta that we start to hear Kendrick speaking the first lines of a poem, and as the tracks go on, additional lines are revealed. We'll get to how this culminates in a little bit. One great thing about To Pimp a Butterfly is that the moods change from track to track, and while there is a consistent concept, the musical styles and moods change nicely. Institutionalized brings in an unbelievable guest trio of Snoop Dogg, Anna Wise, and Bilal, who help back up a much more deliberately conscious, subtle track where Kendrick digs into some self-reflection and illustrates the evils of wealth and how that can ruin a person, effectively labeling money as the entity that can institutionalize an individual. The fifth track, These Walls, keep Bilal and Anna Wise on the mix and vocals while bringing back Thundercat, as Kendrick uses the saying, "If these walls could talk," at first as a reference to sex, with the walls referring to a specific part of a woman. Just use your imagination a little bit. He takes the metaphor deeper as the song unfolds and references a relationship with a woman who has a man in prison. And finally, the metaphor morphs, referring to the walls that become the human psyche, and in the case of this song, illustrate Kendrick dealing with guilt. The song is upbeat, danceable, and smooth, and features frequent collaborator Soundwave, who gets a co-production credit here. The moods only continue to change as the album goes on, and the song You kind of builds off that feeling of being trapped in your own psyche that's explored at the end of These Walls. It is a dark expression of self-doubt, insecurity, anxiety, and anger. During the song over a morose but somehow still funky instrumental, Kendrick paints the picture of sitting with a bottle of liquor and just letting his negativity fly, showing yet another level of vulnerability and another type of emotion. We're only 6 tracks in at this point, but already there's been just such a wide sentimental range. Right on cue to keep with this ever-changing musical theme, one of the album's most upbeat and iconic anthems pumps right in. All Right was a song that was immediately one of the most recognizable off of the album, and one that actually went on to be a rallying cry for the African-American community as the slayings by police continued throughout the mid-2010s. There was a higher prevalence of people having cameras in their pocket, basically smartphones. So if you remember back to that time, there were a lot of killings that were taking place, very high-profile killings that were really igniting the community. And about 5 years later, after the senseless killing of George Floyd Floyd in Minneapolis in May 2020, the song kind of took on a whole new meaning. The song may be upbeat, but it's more of an encouragement to the African American community that no matter what happens, we'll band together, we'll be alright. And it's actually really sad that this track even has to exist given the injustices that still take place. Pharrell Williams and Soundwave deliver a very appropriate instrumental, as Kendrick spreads positivity and motivation, albeit due to grim circumstances. At the end of Alright, Kendrick's poem extends to include a line that reads, "The evils of Lucy was all around me." Lucy in this case refers to Lucifer, aka Satan, and on the album's 8th track, For Free, we see him mentioning that any artist, any creative mind can have all the success they've ever dreamed and hoped for by simply selling their soul to the devil. It is a thought-provoking interlude that digs deep on the theme of exploitation, and while the subject matter is kind of a dark metaphor, the music is upbeat, and on the surface, it's a nice mid-album break. The next few tracks actually continue more of that mellow, relaxing vibe before we get into some dramatic emotional swings to end the record. Mama is a song that sees Kendrick returning to his home of Compton after achieving fame. He sees his family, he speaks about the evils of Lucy, and really everything else he's covered on the album so far to this point. It's also speculated that Mama may refer to the trip to Africa, aka the motherland. Ultimately, the song is a loose homage to his home, and in the third verse, he has a conversation with a little boy from his neighborhood, and he warns the boy of the exploitative nature of the world beyond Compton. Hood Politics talks a little bit more about his past and personal foundation, and Kendrick changes the pitch of his voice to simulate a version of his younger self. How Much a Dollar Costs is another extremely introspective but also soft and lush track that features the singers James Fauntleroy and Ronald Isley. One of the deepest songs on the album over a lush piano-driven beat, Kendrick tells the story of how he is approached by a beggar who asks him for money and Kendrick refuses to give it to him. This was apparently based on an experience he had in South Africa. The man later reveals himself as God and locks Kendrick out of heaven due to his greed. So while these songs are some of the most mellow musical songs that you'll find on this record, the subject matter is extremely meaningful, layered, introspective, and ultimately dark. The juxtaposition of these different moods is one of the things that makes To Pimp a Butterfly so remarkable. It can lull you into feeling good with these funky upbeat grooves or relax you with these soft piano parts, but the injustices that are being explored over these instrumentals are ever present and do not disappear just because the surrounding is soothing to the senses. Perhaps this is a deeper thematic metaphor for society as a whole. Complexion, a Zulu Love, brings in the extremely talented rapper Rhapsody over a bright introspective beat from Thundercat and Soundwave. The song's ultimate and straightforward message is no matter how light or dark skinned somebody is, we should all be loved equally as we share this planet and society that we live in. It is a hopeful, brighter song, but it does deal with the observation that in general, the darker one's skin color, the more problems that person is likely to have. And that perfectly sets up The Blacker the Berry, which does more than just address the injustices that I outlined earlier. It addresses black pride, calls out racism, calls out hypocrisy within the African American community. And Kendrick does this over one of the most energetic and menacing beats on the entire album, produced by Boy Wanda, Kaz, and Terrace Martin. While the entire album is a stark commentary on society that gets borderline abstract at times, The Blacker the Berry is as furiously straightforward as it gets and is the energetic climax of the album. This is not to say that the last 3 tracks slouch on any level. In fact, they're some of the most powerful songs on this album. You Ain't Gotta Lie is another upbeat, funky track that cleverly emphasizes that being real is paramount, and doing anything otherwise is probably going to get you in trouble, especially if you're a rapper or entertainer. As mentioned earlier, the 15th track, I, is an upbeat, confident song that offers some light at the end of what's been a long, stark, realistic, hour-long to this point journey. On the album version, a live crowd is mocked up, and at the end of the song, Kendrick places himself into an open mic type situation and addresses the crowd with some racially and politically charged a cappella bars. While The Blacker the Berry is the energetic climax, the thematic climax comes on the album's last track, Mortal Man. The first 5 minutes or so seem pretty normal as Kendrick delivers some great rhymes, kind of wrapping up the album's concepts over a calm, introspective beat from Soundwave. But it's at the end of the song that we hear some majestic strings start to take over, as Kendrick finally recites his poem in full, which had been building line by line as the tracks had gone by. After finishing the poem, we hear the sound of paper rustling, and then Kendrick proceeds to ask someone what they thought of it. Immediately after, responding to Kendrick, we hear Tupac Shakur's voice. Using clips from an interview with a Swedish radio show in 1994, Kendrick simulates a posthumous conversation with Tupac, splicing clips of Tupac's voice together as Kendrick asks him questions. It sounds kind of corny as I explained it, but it's actually one of the coolest things I've ever heard on a hip-hop record. And it's in fact pretty mind-blowing when you think about how much of an influence Tupac was to Kendrick Lamar and many other West Coast artists. Tupac was just a godlike figure in California California in the 90s, which is when Kendrick Lamar was growing up. The two talk about the state of society, which leads the listener to realize that 20 years after this interview, not many of the injustices that plague society have gotten really any better. They've just evolved in malicious new ways. Toward the 12-minute mark of the track, the background music suddenly gets apprehensive as Kendrick asks Tupac one more question. When Shakur doesn't respond, we hear Kendrick call his name a couple of times, and very abruptly, this song and the album come to a close. Okay, that was a lot. I'm thirsty. You know, even though I went over To Pimp a Butterfly in quite a bit of detail, my words just don't do it justice. This is an album that just deserves to be listened to over and over and over again. You put the lyrics and the concept aside for just a moment and you realize just how beautiful and dense this thing is musically. There is just so much going on, and I always find myself saying this about albums that are just so deep from a musical perspective. I always notice and hear something new with every listen. You can in fact apply that to the lyrics as well. The concept, which along the way includes characters like Uncle Sam, Lucy, and the homeless man that turns to God, it's just extremely ambitious and intricate. The excellent musical soundscapes combine beautifully with this hyperdense concept, and that also combines with even the diverse delivery of Kendrick Lamar, as he never seems to rap in this same tone of voice or style from song to song. I think that's actually one of the most underrated qualities of this album is Kendrick's versatility as an MC. All these things give this album infinite replay value. I mean that. I could listen to this album probably for the rest of my life and never truly grasp it. I listened to this album a handful of times while brainstorming for this video, and all I want to do is go back and revisit it again and again and again. We mentioned some of the producers that had credits on this album, such as Flying Lotus, Soundwave, Boy Wonder, Terrace Martin, Thundercat, Pharrell Williams, and others. The instrumental contributions go way beyond the track's individual producers, with just a litany of names in this album's credits. For instance, SZA provides background vocals on You and For Sale. Saxophonist Kamasi Washington wails his horn on You and helps with the string arrangements throughout. The legendary Robert Glasper contributes keyboards to 5 of the album's tracks. Pete Rock even jumps in with background vocals and scratches on Complexion. Dr. Dre provides guest vocals in a few spots in addition to serving as an executive producer. We've already covered a lot of the guest vocal appearances as well, and they are so strategically utilized by Kendrick Lamar and the executive production team that it still just amazes me. To have Snoop Dogg provide that hook on Institutionalized, man, that just hits perfectly. George Clinton's confident, quirky, and awkward presence is just tailor-made for a song like Wesley's Theory. Hearing Ronald Isley's voice on How Much a Dollar Costs is nostalgic and soothing. Rhapsody's guest verse on Complexion is just out of this world, and for the record, she's an MC that doesn't get nearly as much love and attention as she should. For Kendrick Lamar to come back some 2.5 years after the release of Good Kid, Mad City and give us an album that surpasses it musically and conceptually, it's just unbelievable. As Good Kid, Mad City was already arguably the best hip-hop album of the 21st century before To Pimp a Butterfly came along. It's debatable which one is better, but just know this, to have an artist that puts out 2 records of this quality in less than 5 years, that's nearly unheard of. And I love modern day Kendrick Lamar. I love Damn, I love Mr. Morale and GNX, and I love how versatile of an artist he is, and how every single one of his full-length albums dating all the way back to Section 80 offers a new, fresh perspective. He's one of the most flexible and multifaceted artists, and each entry into his catalog is a unique new journey. This is a quality that only the best artists of all time have exhibited, and I see it in the catalogs of David Bowie, the Beatles, and Radiohead, and not many others. In my eyes, Kendrick Lamar is an exclusive member of this club. Do you think To Pimp a Butterfly is one of Kendrick Lamar's best? Is it one of the best 21st century hip-hop albums, in your opinion? Is it in your running for the best hip-hop album of all time? Let me know down below what you think. I'm really interested to hear everybody's thoughts and opinions. As we hit the 10-year anniversary of To Pimp a Butterfly, I'm happy to say that this album is just as influential and awesome as it's ever been. It's held up perfectly. It's one of those hip-hop albums that goes down in history, in all-time lore in fact, that transcends taste, socioeconomic status, and culture. Kendrick stays true to his message, his mission, his pride in who he is, as well as where he comes from, all while paying tribute to some of the most storied musical genres that were created and evolved through African-American society and culture. After tens of thousands of years of human society, the fact that I exist at the same time as Kendrick Lamar and To Pimp a Butterfly, it's got me feeling pretty lucky.